Hey, what is up, all you art freaks? Today we're going to talk about why hands are so difficult to paint. At least for me, hands are a little bit difficult. I've always found that painting the face versus the hand, there's not even a competition. The hands are so much tougher to paint, especially if you don't paint them all the time. I do want to quickly mention that I do have a bunch of Patreon tutorials. This very video is a Patreon tutorial. The full length video is 2.5 hours where I paint this hand and talk about all the things that I'm thinking about while I paint it to help me along the process. I think it'd be great for anybody that's a beginner in oil painting all the way to advanced, but there's a lot of other tutorials, so check those out. Now, back to what we're discussing, all about why hands are so difficult. And like usual, I asked this question to ChatGPT: why is painting the hand so difficult? And it gave me a good few pointers. What did it give me here? It gave me about 8 different bullet points. We're going to talk about some of them. Maybe I'll skip a couple too. The first thing it says is painting hands can be challenging for several reasons. And here's some factors that can contribute to the difficulty. The first one is complex anatomy. And that's exactly where I would go with my answer to why hands are so difficult. You think about a hand, there are so many different things you got to think about. You got to think about the different length of each finger. You got to think about getting those fingernails in there just right. I see so many hand paintings out there where everything looks great, the hand looks amazing, and then you get to those fingernails and it's almost like you forget how to paint. And I've had this sort of situation myself, especially as an impressionist style painter. I do find that once you get to those fingernails, getting the right amount of detail, just the right amount to indicate that there is a fingernail, can be tricky when you're an impressionist painter. And sometimes I just don't even pretend they're there. Sometimes I just blow the fingernails completely off and don't even worry about it because my paintings are loose enough to where I can not even justify showing the fingernails. The second one that ChatGPT mentions here is subtle gradations. And this is what it says here on ChatGPT. The skin on hands often has subtle color variations, shadows, and highlights that can be challenging to replicate. This kind of goes back to the complex anatomy one, but we'll talk about it a little bit more. I guess this could apply to really the whole hand, but shadows can be very tricky on a hand because the back side of the hand has so many slight changes in direction. There's peaks and valleys all over the place that are happening very subtly to indicate certain parts of the anatomy of the hand that if you don't get those just right, if you overemphasize the shadows or underemphasize the shadows, something's going to feel wrong. So it can take a little bit of time. I always feel like I'm having to relearn the painting process for a hand that can be efficient. And that's just a difficulty that I have because I'm not painting hands every day. Let's get to the next one. Fine details. Okay, well, this one might not apply too much for an impressionist painter like myself, but the fine details like wrinkles, creases, and veins, and like I mentioned, say the cuticles of the fingernail or all those little tight details, you can usually just ignore those things with an impressionist style hand if the scale isn't too big. Those things can be very difficult, especially if you are a hyperreal painter. Getting into all those little small nuances can be very, very troubling. I think one of the reasons I like painting in an impressionist style is because I don't want to deal with all those details. So we're going to skip that one a little bit. If you're a hyperreal painter, good luck in your journey. Now the next one, expressiveness. And what it says here is hands are expressive and can convey emotions. I agree with that. I think hands are pretty expressive, especially for me. I like it when I put a hand in front of a face or it's interacting with a face. That creates a lot of story, a lot of emotion, just from how delicate the hand is maybe pointing in a certain direction. There's so many little things you can do with the gesture of a hand to create an expressiveness. The next one on here is proportions and foreshortening. And this one is definitely one that can be a little tricky for sure, because first off, foreshortening, that's when, say, the finger is pointing away from the viewer. It's starting to disappear into the background. It's going away from the viewer. So it shrinks in scale as the finger goes further away, or it gets bigger as it comes closer to the viewer. You have to think about how those proportions change depending on if it's pointing away or towards the viewer or the camera. And if you get this just a little bit wrong, it can feel like you just have a really short finger. Say the finger bends and it points directly away at the knuckle, and it looks like it's just a really short finger because you didn't get the proportions to tell the story of that finger disappearing into the background. Now, the next one for why painting hands is so difficult is texture. I don't know if we need to get into this too much because as an impressionist painter, you only really have to show some texture in important places, like say the knuckles, where that knuckle skin sort of builds up and starts to create sort of a bulge on the over the knuckle. That is one area where I would say the texture really matters. Obviously, if you have an older hand, there's more texture to the hand. If it's a younger person's hand, it's way smoother. These are things, again, a hyperreal painter will have to deal with a little bit more than an impressionist style painter. We're more concerned with just getting the light and shadow and the story across without as much detail. So we'll go to the next one. Okay, the next one that ChatGPT mentions here is lighting challenges. This one is definitely important. It's probably in my top 3 on why hands can be so difficult. There are times when the lighting and the shadows can be a little bit easier, especially if you have a hand in a position where it's not adding more shadows on other parts of the hand. But more likely than not, there's going to be a shadow from the hand affecting something else in your painting. And if you don't get those shadows correct underneath the hand or wherever those deeper shadows are and get them shaped properly, just like getting the fingers shaped properly, you're not going to have a realistic portrayal or a really well done impressionist portrayal of the hand. So make sure to pay a lot of attention to the shadows because that can actually help with telling the story of the hand itself, even outside the shadows. Okay, well, that was all of ChatGPT's points. I think it did a great job today. I think it nailed it. I think it was right on the money with everything it mentioned here. Hands can be a lot more difficult. There's more pieces to the anatomy. There's more changes of direction. There's just so many subtle shadows and direction changes to the hand and getting everything scaled properly. And because it can be positioned in so many different ways, you could be a pro at one particular pose with a hand, and then suddenly you're working on a different direction or a different, more dynamic pose. And then all of a sudden it feels like you're just starting from scratch. So learning to paint with shapes, seeing shapes clearly is always something I preach in all of my tutorials. So again, check out my Patreon page if you want to learn to see the shapes, and this will apply to hands, it will apply to portraits, it will apply to anything you're painting that's based in the real world. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to know what your thoughts are on how you paint hands, how you approach painting hands. I think there are so many different ways that people do approach this subject. I know a lot of others like to rely on line-based methods to get everything in the right place before they start to proceed with all the painting process, but I'm sure I'm leaving some other methods out. Feel free to let me know what those are. I would love to hear them, but I'm sure every one of you art freaks can agree hands are definitely one of the more challenging subjects to paint. Thank you so much for checking out another one of my videos. I will talk to you again very soon. Bye.